You've got people, and it's a perfect way to describe the campaign she's presenting to the people. She's talking about small businesses. She's talking about commanding the most lethal military in the world. She's talking about generals that are called Donald Trump a disgrace. And she's talking about lifting up the middle class. I mean, this is not an ideological platform she's presenting to the country. And
in fact, we just heard her a minute ago say, we love our country. That's not a conservative idea. That's not a, that's not a,
it's not a MAGA line anymore.
It's kind of amazing because, and this is the idea, I've written a little bit about this, about how she's taken back the word freedom, how she's taken back the idea of American exceptionalism, which Democrats didn't have anything to do with. She has brought it back and turned it around to say, partially it's the immigrant experience, it's the fact that we're a culture of opportunity. She wants to create an opportunity economy. That is what American exceptionalism is about. And remember, Donald Trump was the first declinist to ever win the presidency, the first person to say, America is a failing state. Remember, how could you ever run for president that way? Well, it's coming home to roost now because people do not want to elect someone who says America is a failing state.
Well, and April, to your point, he Kristi Noemed his own campaign. I mean, stay away from the dogs. As a campaign operative, I was not always influential and I was not always right, but I warned everyone I ever worked for to never invoke Nazis and to never attack pets. And you've got, Trump going to places and breaking both of those rules. What do you make of how alienating his last 48 hours have been?
Well, what I make of it is someone who's being tone deaf to his staffers and to the Republican Party. He is now on his own ropes because he knows he did not handle that last debate well. And that showed by him coming into the spin room, speaking to many reporters, to include myself. And, Nicole, I'm here just a block away from the D.C. Convention Center where the annual legislative Black Caucus for the CBC is happening. And there is more of an enthusiasm here for her. People are watching how Donald Trump is crumbling, if you will, in the midst of this moment where Kamala Harris has risen to the top, where she has been authentically herself, and he's trying to find himself. He is throwing himself out into areas that he once said no to. And forgive, there is an ambulance driving down the street. You hear the sirens. But Donald Trump is going into areas like abortion. Not abortion per se, but he was saying abortion and talking in terms that are not true about people having abortions, after the 9th month, or killing the baby after it's born. Things that are not true. And now he's trying to put into the conversation the issue about being a champion for IVF. And he is not that champion for IVF because just the beginning of this year, Donald Trump had said that he stood by Republicans, again, who did not feel that that was a good issue. And now he's saying he's a champion because he wants, he says in nice terms, for people to have babies. He said, we need to have more babies. Who is the we? And that goes into another thing. The devil is in the details with Donald Trump. Who is the we to have babies? Is this about the browning of America that he does not like? In subtle terms, saying that we white people need to have more babies. This is a lot of code for a lot of people, and he's falling down a rabbit hole that he's creating for himself.
Charlie, a journalist like April can follow all those twists and turns. And the problem with the pets is that you don't have to have 8 years of Trump history down the way April Ryan and really a small and kind of accomplished group of journalists, understand and can decode all of that. The problem for Trump with their eating the dogs is everyone knows that's bat bleep crazy. Everybody.
Well, a lot of this is familiar to those of us that have, lived through the Trump years. But I wonder whether or not this is a revelation for the tens of millions of people who turned into this debate and are looking at one another going, what is he talking about? What is this that he's doing? And, we kind of know what he's doing here. He has followed J.D. Vance and others and Laura Loomer down some of these dark rabbit holes, and he's done it willingly, playing the race card more aggressively and with uglier tones than anyone, I think, in American politics has done in more than half a century. So that what you're seeing is not merely that he's weird and he's extreme, but he really is reminding people how ugly his message is. And I guess that's part of the contrast that you're seeing here. You know, the Kamala Harris is frankly, and I will confess, doing much better than I expected. Really exceeding my expectations. Donald Trump is living up to the darkest expectations we have of him. And we are, again, only 54 days away from the election. And he's flying around with one of the most notorious racist conspiracy theorists, somebody like Laura Loomer, who is a 9/11 denialist, takes her to the 9/11 ceremonies. And he has surrounded himself with people who are encouraging his worst and darkest impulses. And he's hoping to play on the worst and darkest impulses of the American people, because this is what he thinks works. If he can convince Americans to fear immigrants, that he will protect Americans from these angry, scary black people who are going to eat your kittens and your dogs. Unfortunately for him, it just comes off as crazy. It comes off as ludicrous. But what's very interesting is that neither he or J.D. Vance are backing off from it, even though it's been exposed as a lie, because they have decided they want that narrative. They want the narrative of racial fear. They are going to play with that meme that the story out of Springfield may be fake, but they're saying this is a larger truth, that we need to be terrified. And he thinks this has worked for him in the past. But I think the contrast right now, where you have somebody who is talking about an optimistic future versus, as Richard points out, a declinist who is constantly running down the country saying, that we, in fact, are becoming an S-hole country, that we are a country in decline. That contrast is very, very powerful. But again, we are seeing Donald Trump at his ugliest, and that's saying a lot after the last 9 years.
Yeah, and just listening to you, I mean, the why it matters, I think, is abundantly clear to people as well. Why it matters that you stand on a debate stage with 70 million people watching and say, but I saw it on TV, is because you're not running to, have a show on, the internet. You're running to be the president of the United States, to look at the best information and be able to decipher that which you learned from your PDB and that which you saw on TV. I have a tween who doesn't say, well, I saw it on TV. It's so disqualifying. And what Kamala Harris's greatest political success, I think, to date has been, and I wasn't one who underestimated her because I was desperate to see men like Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr held to account. And she was singular in her ability to do it on live TV without a lot of notes in real time. But what she's been able to do to our politics is, if you view Trump as a cancer to the body politic, she's decided to shrink the tumor before she eliminates it. And it has been delightful to watch her shrink him and make him look petty and small and uninformed and irrelevant. And that, to me, is what they're eating the dog's opportunity that he has given all of us.